Hi everyone, Aaron here for Zollotech, and iOS 13 has a bunch of battery optimizations already built in, but I wanted to share with you some tips to help you better refine those optimizations and get the most battery life possible. And these tips are directly from Apple. There are a lot of tips out there, but these come straight from Apple and will save you the most power possible. Now, the first thing is to use AutoBrightness, but in tandem with AutoBrightness, you also want to use brightness control in the control center. So leave auto brightness on, which will actually adjust the brightness based on the ambient light. So if you're in a very bright room, or maybe you're outside, it will turn the brightness way up. But if you're inside, it will bring it down. However, if you leave that on and then also control it yourself, you'll get the best battery life possible. Your screen actually uses a tremendous amount of power. That's probably one of the most power hungry things. So if you can bring that brightness down a little bit when you're inside, just control it here and let Apple handle the rest. That is what they suggest, and I've found that to be true as well. Now, something a lot of people don't even think about is your phone locking itself after not using it for a little bit. So we want to make sure that we have this setting adjusted properly for AutoLock. So if we go into Settings, and then we go down to Display and Brightness, under Display and Brightness, you'll see it says AutoLock. Now I have this set to never, just so the screen doesn't go dark or lock my display while I'm making this video. But as soon as I'm done making this video, I set it to 30 seconds. If you don't have it set to 30 seconds, I would recommend 30 seconds or a minute so that it actually shuts the display off as soon as it can when you're not using it. True Tone and Night Shift really don't use a whole lot of power, so you can leave those on. I tend to like them. Some people don't. It doesn't use much power at all, so you can either leave it on or turn it off. But before we go to the next tip, first a word from our sponsor. This video is brought to you by .tech domains, and if you're online, it's pretty essential to have a domain. If you have a business or a social presence or a YouTube channel or any of those things, a domain is pretty essential. And especially if you cover tech, there's now .tech domains. My channel is Zollotech, so of course I have the domain zollo.tech to link to all of my branding. In fact, companies like Intel and Viacom and CES also have .tech domains, so type in go.tech/Zollo and use the code Zollo.tech to get 90% off 1- and 5-year domains. And let me know what you're planning to build in the comments below. Now, something that's specific to phones with OLED displays is dark mode. And while you can use dark mode on older phones, dark mode only really helps battery life on phones with OLED technology displays. So OLED is on the iPhone 10, the 10s, the 10s Max, and the 11 Pro and 11 Pro Max. It uses a different type of display, and where there is a complete black part of the display, those pixels are actually turned off. So it's saving power by turning those pixels off. So if you're using dark mode, for example, and you go into settings, any area where it is completely dark or black, the pixels are just completely off, as opposed to having to light the whole display like an LCD, as you have on some of the other devices, such as an iPhone 8 or 7 or any of those devices. So just keep that in mind. So that will help you a little bit on those OLED displays. Now, something that uses a lot of power is location services, and you can adjust these in settings. So if we go into settings and go down to privacy, under privacy, we have location services. Under location services, we can adjust each app individually or turn it off altogether. I don't recommend normally turning it off altogether unless you don't want to use things like Maps, because Maps needs to know your location so that it can function properly. So if you're using Google Maps or Apple Maps or something else, you'll need to actually use it to use that app. But you can tell what apps are actually using your location based on these little arrows here. And these arrows indicate the time in which they've actually used your location. So Instagram has used my location within the past 24 hours. Now I allow it to use my location while I'm using the app, but never any other times. So you can adjust this specifically to what works for you. Maps, for example, while I'm using the app, it can use my location. Otherwise, you don't need to know my location. So you can adjust this on a app-by-app basis. You can also tweak system services, and if you don't use some of these services, I would recommend turning them off. For example, if you don't use HomeKit to control your lights, turn it off, or location-based alerts, or location-based Apple ads. I don't really need those, so I'll turn them off. Or motion calibration and distance, things like that. If there's certain apps you don't use, I would turn them off. And also significant locations. Turn that off unless you want it to know your location. What it does is it's not sharing it with Apple, but it's keeping it on the phone where it's been to significant locations. So I would recommend going into this. You'll see it's kind of creepy. It will show you all your last locations. You can leave that on or turn it off, but again, it's going to use power. Now, if you have a purple arrow here that's hollow, it's kind of using it in the background, or if it's filled, it used it recently. You can get an explanation for the arrows at the bottom of the settings page for privacy and location, and it will tell you exactly what they mean. One way you can save more power is to use Wi-Fi whenever possible. As long as you're at a safe location, such as your home, and you're using Wi-Fi, that's going to save you more power than if you're on cellular data. And the reason for that, you can think of it like this. If you're on Wi-Fi, your wireless router's probably within 100 feet of you, whereas a cell tower could be within a couple miles of you, and it has to transmit further distances, so it needs to use more power to do so. That's one way to look at it to understand that it's actually using a lot more power than Wi-Fi. Now, another way to save power, according to Apple, is to turn off background app refresh, or at least select certain apps not to use it. And what that means is if we go into settings, and then we go to general, and then we go to background app refresh, we can turn it off altogether, or we can leave it on for specific apps. So, for example, I may want to use it when I'm on Maps, because Maps may need to use my location information as well as data in the background. Just like I showed with location, you want it to maybe refresh in the background. But all these other apps, if I've opened them and closed them out or swiped them off the screen, I don't want them to use this information if I'm not interested in it. So just turn those off on a case-by-case basis, or turn it off altogether. Now, when the app is actually swiped up, it's closed out for the most part. You do not need to go back and close your apps. There's no reason to do that. In fact, it goes into a sleep mode, with the exception of some apps like music, like Spotify. If it's playing in the background and you want it to stop without just pausing it, you can close that out, or Maps. But everything else, it just freezes, and it's not really using any power in the background. Now, another thing that can use a lot of power is if you're using the Mail app from Apple, is the way it actually gets that mail. So what that means is there are multiple ways to do that. You can either have the mail pushed to you, or you can have it fetch the mail every so often, or go out and look for new mail. Now, you want to adjust those settings by going under settings, and then instead of going to mail, go to passwords and accounts. Under passwords and accounts, at the bottom, you'll see it says fetch new data. If we tap on this, you'll see I have it set to push. Push will actually use more power because it's trying to regularly check for more information so that the email just pushes. Now, I have that turned on for iCloud and Outlook, but I have it set to fetch for a couple others. And fetch means it will check every 30 minutes. Now, the best power saving option here is to turn off push and then switch this to manually. That way it will actually not check for mail unless you want it to and you go into the Mail app. That's the best option. However, you won't know if you're getting any new email unless you go into the Mail app itself. So just keep that in mind. But that's the best way to save power as far as mail is concerned. Now, there are some apps that could be using your power as well. So if you have apps like Facebook, and Facebook has been the number one for me, I removed it because it was using a bunch of power and there was nothing I seemingly could do about it. So I removed that. I still have Messenger and Facebook Page, or the Page Manager, but I would recommend any app you're not using, specifically social media apps, things like that, I would remove them altogether if you're not using them, because they're probably using your power in some way or another. I've found that they say they're not, and people will say they're not using it, but for some reason, I always find that I have better battery life if I really tweak settings for things like Facebook, or just remove it altogether. Now, there are modes to actually help you save power, such as low power mode, but I don't normally recommend this unless you're down to about 20% and really trying to conserve power. The reason for that is not only does it optimize brightness and bring all the brightness down, but it actually slows the phone down to save power. It will reduce the amount of power that the processor is using to try and save you power, and in turn slow the phone down. So it reduces animations, it stops fetching mail, it disables things like AirDrop and iCloud Sync, and features like continuity won't work. So it turns off a bunch of features, and you've got a nice phone. Why not use the features unless you're really trying to conserve power? So I recommend only using low power mode when you're down to about 20% or you're trying to really conserve battery throughout the day. Now, finally, if you're in an area where you have almost no cellular signal, you have no access to Wi-Fi, and it keeps going between no signal and a signal, I would recommend turning on airplane mode, as Apple does, so that you actually save as much power as possible. And the reason for that is the further you are from a cell tower, the more power your phone has to use in order to connect to that cell phone or cell tower. So in order to connect to the cell tower, it has to ramp up the power of the phone, connect to that cell tower, and then communicate back and forth. So if it's constantly going between no signal and a signal, I would turn that off altogether until you get to an area where you know you have signal. Unless you really, really need it and you're trying to contact someone in an emergency, definitely turn it to airplane mode if you're in that situation. Now, as far as Bluetooth, people always ask me, should I turn off Bluetooth? The only time I would say turn off Bluetooth is if you're not using an Apple Watch or AirPods or something like that, because Bluetooth is so low power that it almost makes no difference for most people. So it's more the display that's using power or the processor, not so much Bluetooth, because it's very low power and it's fairly limited in range as well. And hopefully those battery tips helped you. That's really all there is to it. Follow those tips and really adjusting the brightness. You'll probably see the most change along with that background app refresh. But let me know if you have any other tips in the comments below. And also, if you'd like to get your hands on this wallpaper, of course, I'll link it in the description, as I always do. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe and hit that notification bell if you'd like to see more of these videos as soon as they're released. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.